Good evening. I love that I have to interrupt people's conversations to get started. That's a really good sign. Welcome to the Church of the Redeemer and to the third in a series of conversations, lectures of our Voices series. Tonight, I'm so pleased to welcome Hahrie Hahn. Hahrie is the inaugural director of the SNF Agora Institute, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Professor of Political Science, and factory director of the P3 Research Lab at Johns Hopkins. She's an award-winning author of 4 books and numerous articles published in leading scholarly outlets, including the American Political Science Review, the American Sociological Review, Nature Human Behavior, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and elsewhere. She's also written for the New York Times and the Washington Post and others. Tonight, she's going to talk about her current book, which I just learned is now in proofs, so it really is, it's going to happen, right? I mean, you can hold on to it. And it's titled Undivided, The Quest for Racial Solidarity in an American Church. So great to welcome you, Hahrie.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thanks so much, David, for the introduction and for inviting me here. Is it too loud? Okay, I don't know how to turn this down. Hold on, let me see. I don't know if I control the volume. Okay, maybe I'll try to put the mic further away from my face. Or I can I hold it further away? Is this better if I hold it like that? Okay, so maybe I'll just hold it. Anyways, I'm excited to have this conversation with you all, and should I just keep doing this? Should I just stick with this? Okay. I have to say, as David said, I have a book coming out this September, and so this is actually my first talk about the book, and so I'm excited to kind of get your feedback. We just got through page proofs, and so it's almost in galleys, but I don't quite have a copy of the book yet, but I'm excited to see what you guys think, and you can give me any feedback that you want, because I can barely change a few typos here and there at this point. Anyways, and I also want to, it's really lovely to see, some people that I've just met tonight and people that I knew before, but I also want to thank Claire and Vicky from my book club who are here. And I was realizing on the way here that there's potentially nothing more intimidating than talking about your book with people in your book club, because I've heard them viciously rip into other authors. And so I'm imagining in my head what Claire and Vicky would say if I wasn't in the room, so we'll see. I thought that I'd start by giving you a little bit of background on the project and how I got into it, and then I can share a little bit of the book with you. And I'll sort of start by saying that the book is new for me in a number of different ways. First, it's a trade book. It's being published by Knopf, and it's written in the style of narrative nonfiction. So it's a nonfiction story, but it is written kind of like as a story. So think about, I don't know if you're familiar with Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, or Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns. It's kind of written in that style. But that's a new style of writing for me, and so it's been really, one of the things that's been really fun and a real gift about this project is just learning how to do a different kind of writing, which has been really fun. But then the other thing is that I really came upon this project very much by happenstance. And so most of my work in the past and most of my writing in the past has been on community organizing and social movements and trying to understand kind of how you pull people off the sidelines into public life and get them involved in politics in different ways. And I happened upon this project because I was working with some colleagues to research a campaign in Cincinnati, Ohio in 2016 that seemed unusual to us because in 2016, if you guys remember, Trump and Clinton were running. It was kind of the pretty brutal election. Trump won Ohio by about 10 percentage points. But in that same election, there was a new ballot initiative that passed in Cincinnati by the largest margin of any education levy in Cincinnati history. And it was a new policy to essentially create universal preschool education for the poorest children in the city. And given kind of the demographics of Cincinnati, what that meant was it essentially was redistributing wealth with targeted resources for the kind of poor Black community in Cincinnati. And so it was a sort of unusual thing where people voted new taxes in for themselves. And so we wanted to understand, how did that happen? And how did that happen in the context of 2016, which is this moment of like really high polarization, a lot of divisiveness, a lot of racial divides, and so we wanted to try to understand what was happening. And so I went to Cincinnati, and we were talking to a bunch of people and trying to understand, like, how do they build this citywide campaign to pass this initiative, and that really kind of bucked the trend for a lot of what we saw across the country in other elections. And people kept telling me, like, well, like this thing happened and that thing happened, but there was this church that sent all these volunteers to participate in the campaign. And I sort of nodded politely, because people say that a lot when you study political campaigns, and usually it's like, a few people like sitting in the basement of a church with like some wheat thins and like trying to figure out how to like call voters on their phone, and they kind of call like 10 voters or so or something like that, right? And so I sort of nod politely and say, okay, yeah, of course, like the church sent volunteers, right? And but then the more I dug into it, what it turned out was that all these volunteers were coming from this huge Protestant evangelical megachurch in the city. And it was a mixed race group of Black and white volunteers who had, as the campaign manager, who was this person who had run like a ton of really bitter political campaigns throughout the Midwest, said he had never seen anything like it. These people really just like devoted themselves to this campaign. There was hundreds of volunteers from the church that did that. And so I thought, that's strange, right? Because it's strange not only to see that level of commitment and volunteerism, but it's also strange for it to be coming from a Protestant evangelical megachurch, which, I'm sure many of you saw the statistics in the news where it's like, 9 in 10 voters voted for Trump, 9 in 10 evangelical voters, voted for Trump. And so it felt strange, it felt funny to kind of like understand this. And so that's what propelled me to kind of dive into this campaign. And it turned out that like a lot of these volunteers were coming from a church called Crossroads. Crossroads is like the third largest megachurch in the country. Nowadays, it's a church that gets about 35,000 people to show up across. They have 10 different campuses across southern Ohio and northern Kentucky, and they get about 35,000 people a week in person, and then about 500,000 people that tune in online. So they just had this like enormous scale to the church, and it's a white dominant church. The head pastor is white. The congregation is about 80% white, 20% non-white, which given the kind of demographics of Ohio means the non-white population is almost entirely Black. And that was a church that was animating all these volunteers. And so I thought, okay, what's going on here? So I started talking to people, and it turns out that what had happened was one of the most popular preachers in the church is a Black preacher named Chuck Mingo. And in 2015, he, in response to a lot of the kind of outcry that was happening around sort of the police shooting of unarmed Black men, he decided that he wanted to speak into some of the racial divides in Cincinnati. And so he had gotten up on the main stage once in the church, and he had sort of preached about his calling to work on race relations, and then unexpectedly got thousands of people who reached out and said, I want to be a part of whatever you're doing. And he thought, I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but like we're going to figure it out because there's like all these people who want to be a part of it. And so he ended up working with like a whole team of people, and they constructed this program that's called Undivided, that essentially was the program that propelled a lot of these volunteers to get involved in this campaign around universal preschool in 2016. So I thought, okay, well that's interesting, so what's Undivided? So I went and I talked to a bunch of people, and I said, can you tell me about Undivided? And so Undivided, basically, it's a 6-week program that's focused on kind of racial justice, and it teaches people a lot of kind of the history of race, structural racism in Cincinnati. It takes them through exercises around empathy. It just sort of does like a lot of things that a lot of DEI programs traditionally do. So that also felt unusual to me because as a social scientist, one of the things that we know is that a lot of the research on DEI programs is that most of them are really ineffective, and so I wanted to try to understand like what makes this one stand out. So I ended up spending, now it's been, 6 or 7 years kind of studying this program. I sat through like multiple sessions of the program. I got to know a lot of people and kind of traced their journeys through it. I worked with a colleague to gather survey data on it. So we have like all this kind of information on the program. And And I think the other thing that as I dove into it that I felt like was happening is that, I was tracing this program sort of through the Trump presidency, so from 2016 through 2020 and the years beyond. And, obviously in 2020 we had the pandemic and George Floyd, and there was kind of that summer of what everyone called kind of like the Great Awakening. And that awakening kind of followed a trend that we see in a lot of social movements throughout the 21st century, where there's this kind of like outcry of action in the beginning that often dissipates quickly thereafter, which is kind of the pattern that we saw after that summer. Is there was a summer of a lot of protests, so many organizations making statements and commitments about all these things that they're going to do, and then it quickly waned over time. And I think one of the things that we see a lot of times is that even people who are really committed to the work of trying to engage around racial justice often find themselves at a certain point where they don't know what else they can do besides vote, march, maybe donate some money every now and then, put a sign out on their lawn. But they they get to a point where they're not sure how to continue to pursue the work. And what was interesting to me is that, there is this group of people here who in this church were committed to kind of continuing to figure out how they stay in relationship with each other and with the work, so in a way that persisted beyond things like the summer of George Floyd. So anyway, so I ended up writing a short little piece about it in the New Republic. It was kind of like probably like 1,500 word article about some of the things that I was seeing in this program. And an editor from Knopf read the piece and reached out and said, I think there's a bigger book here. Would you want to write kind of like a bigger story? And so that's what I've been working on. And so what the book does is it traces, it traces the journeys of 4 people who've gone through Undivided. So 2 Black and so I've written a bunch of books before, but they've all been academic books. So I've never done a book reading where I've actually read a passage of the book before. So we'll see how that goes. And if it doesn't go well, you should give me the feedback, because the book's actually launching in the fall, and so if I shouldn't be doing this in the future, then you should tell me no. And so that would be good information for me to have. Okay, I wonder if I can, I'm just gonna see if I can try to adjust the mic so I don't have to hold it, so just give me 1 second and see if I can do that. How's that? Is that good? Is that okay? Okay. It's not too loud? Oh, it's not loud enough. Okay, let me see. There's probably a magic place where I can put it. Okay. How's that? Is that good? Not too loud? Okay, so I'm gonna try that and then see if I can do that without having to hold the mic. Okay, so what I thought I would do is read a portion of the book that's about a woman named Jess, who's a white woman who kind of got involved in Undivided, and so this is sort of the beginning of her story, and so you'll learn a little bit more about her. But I was going to read 2 different passages about her experience. So this is the beginning of chapter 2. It's called Polished Concrete. The inexorable force of social sanctioning meant that Jess's parents never detected any contradictions in the entangled relationship between the Ku Klux Klan and their childhood churches. People in their circle told them that integrating white supremacist politics with their faith in God was normal, and they never thought to question it. Jess recalled hearing stories about her parents attending Baptist services in Florida for her mom and Southern California for her dad on Sunday morning, and then staying for a potluck lunch. As people digested their sandwiches and coffee, the men would participate in a Klan meeting. Women socialized and children played while men sat around in their Sunday church clothes, discussing ways to advance an agenda of white supremacy. Pursuing an agenda of white power felt natural to Jess's father. He tattooed the words white in large scripted font on the back of his left triceps and the word power on the back of his right triceps. He deliberately wore muscle shirts and tank tops in public to ensure that everyone could see the words. Like all children, Jess turned her head like a sunflower toward the light of her parents' love, even if it was darkened by shadows of hate. Throughout her childhood in Florida and then Ohio, her father worked assiduously to instill a fear of being alone with Black people in Jess and her sister. "They will murder you, they'll beat you up," he said. When Jess was around 8 or 9 years old, she asked a pastor at her family's church what would happen to her Catholic friends when they died. He told her they would go to hell. It scared Jess. She was learning a social order that put white Protestants on top and condemned everyone else. Her pastor did not preach explicit white supremacy. In the 1990s, it would have been socially taboo for him to claim that black people, or non-white people in general, were going to hell because of their skin color. Old-fashioned racism, as some scholars called it, was out of vogue. It had been built on beliefs in the biological inferiority of people of color, a desire for social distance between the races, and a support for policies ensuring racial segregation and formalized discrimination. But over the course of the 20th century, social norms around race changed so dramatically that explicit support for old-fashioned racism seemed to disappear. For example, in 1945, pollsters asked Americans, quote, "Do you think Negroes should have as good a chance as white people to get any kind of job, or do you think white people should have the first chance at any kind of job?" At the time, 55% of respondents thought that employers should prioritize hiring white people. By 1972, however, after the Civil Rights Movement, 97% of whites said blacks should have as good a chance as whites in seeking employment. White Americans, in other words, had come to almost uniformly express support for equal treatment in employment. The racism embedded in people's attitudes and beliefs, however, did not disappear. It had just taken on different forms. As Jess described it, unlike her, quote, "we hate black people" family, most white American families were more likely to say they didn't see color. Claiming the mantle of colorblindness allowed whites to justify their dominance in employment, wealth, education, and other domains, not by biological superiority, but by a commitment to a superior set of, quote, "American values and behaviors," such as individualism, self-reliance, work ethic, and discipline. Some scholars call this laissez-faire or unconscious racism because of its submerged nature. White Americans, like Jess's pastor, could have it both ways. They could claim racially egalitarian ideals by rejecting notions of biological inferiority, but also resist change in the racial status quo by blaming any lack of upward social mobility among black Americans on poor values. Jess thus learned a complex architecture of judgment and reward that carefully parsed different groups of people to maintain the racial order. Hierarchy was a rule, God was a judge, and hell was a stick. As a child, Jess felt like deviating from the social order would send her to hell. But it confused her. Her family could not afford to live in the suburban enclaves that enclosed families in a wrapper of whiteness. The working class neighborhoods where they lived and the schools Jess attended were always racially and religiously diverse. Catholics, blacks, and Latinos were her friends, classmates, and teachers. They weren't scary or undisciplined or lazy like the adults told her they would be, but she didn't know what to do with that. She put her confusion into a box and tried as much as possible to bury it, focusing instead on being a decent kid. In high school, Jess became addicted to opioids and heroin. It wasn't until she became sober in prison that she dug up that box of confusion and reconsidered questions of the social order. In the Ohio State Penitentiary, where Jess served her time, she befriended a racially mixed group of women. She began to ask questions. Why, she wondered, did the guards force the black women, but not the white women, to shave their heads? To rethink her orientation towards race and racism in America, Jess first had to reconsider her orientation to God. She had to let go of the idea that upholding a racialized social order was part of being Christian. Could she differentiate between belief in God and belief in the social institutions, the churches, that taught her about God? In late 2011, Jess was serving a prison sentence in Clermont County, Ohio, just to the east of Hamilton County, where Cincinnati sits. She had been sentenced to 4 years in state prison for burglary and forgery, a byproduct of the daily quest for money she had to take to feed her addiction. She got clean in prison, but was in limbo because she was wanted for 2 additional crimes in Brown County. Jess did some research into sentencing policies in Ohio and realized that, according to Ohio's Fast and Speedy Trial Act, any person incarcerated in an Ohio correctional facility could request a speedy disposition of untried charges pending against them. Jess filed her paperwork and was soon called to court in Brown County. She showed up in the courtroom wearing a green and white prison uniform with handcuffs shackling her wrists and ankles bound to a chain around her waist. She had a pile of paperwork in her hands and waited as the court worked through its docket. Eventually, her court-appointed attorney, a young woman in a red dress and stiletto heels, came to talk to her. Jess shared her fast and speedy trial paperwork with the lawyer and asked if it might have any impact on her case. The attorney glanced through her paperwork and said, "Well, this changes things." She asked for permission to approach the bench with the prosecutor. Jess waited nervously, twisting her hands around in her handcuffs. For many people in the room, judges, bailiffs, lawyers, security guards, journalists, and legal recorders, it was just another day at work, shuffling through papers and cases. For Jess, it felt like her life hung in the balance. Her mom sat behind her in the courtroom. Jess's attorney handed the paperwork to the judge, who looked wearily through it. They exchanged a few sentences, and then the judge called a recess. When the judge and the lawyers returned, the judge was succinct. The charges are dismissed. Jess abruptly slid off the wooden bench to her knees, and her hands went up in a posture of prayer. She was confused, feeling like her body had acted without her control. What made my body move, she wondered. When Jess returned to prison, she described the incident to her bunkmate, who advised her that she should talk to the sergeant about it. Who? Jess asked. Her bunkmate described Sergeant Harris, a guard who was very open with the inmates about his Christian faith. An older white man, Harris was nicer than the other guards. He enforced the rules, but he did so as kindly as possible. Jess sought him out the next day and described what happened. Well, he paused, what if it was Jesus? His question took Jess aback. Did Jesus save me? Jess asked herself. As an employee of the state, Sergeant Harris was not supposed to evangelize the women he supervised in prison. He flouted the rule. I'd rather be accountable to God than to the state, he told Jess. To give Jess a chance to extend her exploration of faith, Sergeant Harris requested that she be given a work detail in an area he supervised. The sergeant's kindness humbled her because she was unaccustomed to people sticking their necks out for her. Jess's gratitude proved easier to win than her faith. At first, she was skeptical when Sergeant Harris asked her questions about God. She thought people who prayed were stupid. There's nothing scientific about prayer, she said to Sergeant Harris. I mean, why do people thank some magical being in the sky for their food? Their food comes from farm workers and factory workers who grow and manufacture their food with their own hands. Sergeant Harris knew that Jess had rejected the church. He was not asking her to revisit that decision. Instead, he wanted her to evaluate God. Just because the churches Jess knew were frightening and divisive, did it mean that God was? Jess wasn't sure. Through her conversations with Sergeant Harris, Jess started differentiating Christianity as a theology from Christianity as a set of institutional practices that she had learned as a child. Who is God? Who is Jesus? He asked. What does it mean to be Christian? Jess discovered that Christianity did not have to be defined by the fire and brimstone fear that she had learned in childhood. So the story goes on to kind of describe her experiences in prison, where she continues to work with Sergeant Harris and find her faith. And so she gets out of prison in 2014, and then when she comes out of prison, she's looking for a church that she can attend and finds Crossroads. It's the biggest church by far in the city, and so it's hard to avoid, really, in a lot of ways. So she gets involved in Crossroads, and for a long time doesn't really want to get involved. I think she feels a little bit shy about getting involved because she knows that she has a record, and she worries that people around her aren't going to want to engage with her because of her criminal record. But when she hears Chuck Mingo, who's a pastor, get up on stage and speak about his calling to work on issues of racial justice, she decides she wants to get involved. And so I'll just read you a little bit about the beginning of her time there. So she goes to she signs up, and when she signs up, she talks a lot about how she went to that first session feeling really scared, and she wasn't sure how much she wanted to reveal about her family's past and the way that she had been raised. And she wasn't sure. She was worried that people would kind of shun her if she if she told the truth. And so the scene that I'm going to read to you is just a little bit of the beginning of her first experience there. So this is the first week of Undivided. They're meeting in the church, and 1,200 people from the church signed up for this program. And so the way the program starts, Chuck, who's the pastor, he starts by welcoming everybody. He takes them, he provides a grounding in faith, and sort of talks about, over the 6 weeks, we're going to do this hard work. We're going to ask everyone to bring their hearts to it, and he kind of walks them through sort of what Undivided is going to be, and then he asks them to get into their small groups, and they're all organized into racially mixed small groups of about 8 to 10 people. They try to have kind of an even white and non-white racial balance in each of the groups, and the first kind of instruction that they're given is to sort of introduce themselves to the group and then talk about some of their first experience of race. And so everyone's kind of going around in the circle. And so this is just a circle. A short white woman with spiky brown hair and frosted tips spoke before anyone else in Jess's group during the first week of Undivided. She, along with an older black woman, was a co-facilitator of the group. Having grown up in a community with barely any non-white people, this white woman had only experienced people of color on TV and had developed stereotypes of black women as aggressive and powerful. Initially, she thought her views were harmless, but she described the ways in which she realized over time the inherent harm in the stereotypes that she had. Jess was taken aback. She thought of her own large frame and the black women that she knew from prison who were self-assured and outspoken, whom she loved. Why is this woman saying it's a problem, Jess thought. She found herself feeling a little annoyed. When the white facilitator mentioned wanting to be an ally, Jess didn't know what that meant. Jess had arrived at Undivided unsure about how to introduce herself and whether to reveal the stark truth about her family. She decided she would be upfront. She was not accustomed to dissembling and didn't want to talk in vague abstractions the way that she felt the white woman was talking. When it came to be her turn, Jess described growing up in Volusia County, Florida, and the poverty, the swamps, and the unpaved sandy roads that marked her childhood. She described her father and the brazen tank tops that he wore to make sure that everyone saw his white supremacist tattoos. Her father died when she was 11, but his hate did not. When Jess was 12 and her sister was 8, they were living outside Cincinnati in a trailer park with their mother. Her mom was dropping Jess and her sister off at her friend's house when the girls met the woman's black boyfriend. Jess's sister started screaming racist epithets, refusing to let her mother leave. Quote, "I carry shame for those things now," Jess said, "but I don't know how else to be. I'm here to learn." Jess let her eyes roam quickly around the circle, landing on the face of a young black woman sitting across from her. The young woman gazed evenly at her, but Jess had to look away. The group was silent after Jess stopped speaking. They hadn't gotten to know one another yet, and no one was sure how to react to Jess's frank admissions. They could not ignore what Jess said, but they weren't ready to engage with it either. The black facilitator thanked Jess for her candor and then moved on to the next person. Just shut up and listen, Jess told herself. It came time for the young black woman sitting across from Jess to speak. She was in her mid-20s and had curly hair and a soft southern twang when she spoke. She described the first time that she realized as a child that some people thought it was a problem that she was black. She had been invited by a white friend to spend the night at her house. The girls were having a good time until it was time to get ready for bed. As they were changing into their pajamas, the white girl started to scrub her black friend's arm with a washcloth to try to remove the color. Jess was dumbfounded, but the other black people in the circle were nodding in affirmation. Jess started to cry. So one of the things about this being the first time is I didn't know how long it would take to read that passage, and so I was going to stop there. I don't know if I could read one more section about another setting, but I'm not sure if I should read one more. Yes, okay. So I'll read one more section. So that was the first session. That was sort of the first week of Undivided, and to kind of put a little more context around it, so there's 1,200 people in this giant room where they, each week they come together, they have a teaching, and then they're put into their small groups and they're assigned to do these different exercises. And so the first week after they do this introduction, then the teaching is about the history of structural racism in Cincinnati. And the people who are planning Undivided worked really hard to try to think about how to structure that first week. And one of the commitments that they had was that they really wanted to try to focus it on the structural aspects of racism, because a lot of the tradition of the way in which the white evangelical church has dealt with questions of race in the past was focused a lot on interpersonal racial reconciliation, right? The idea of trying to help people see their own biases and their own prejudices and then walk them through exercises to kind of eradicate that prejudice from their hearts. And the people who were planning Undivided were really committed to this idea that they wanted people to see that racism had not only a kind of interpersonal element to it, but also was baked into a set of societal structures. And so they wanted to start with the history because they felt like that was a way to be able to kind of bring that sort of structural history into the past. And for those of you who know Cincinnati a little bit, actually I know Vicki is from Cincinnati, right? So Cincinnati, it sits on the border between Ohio and Kentucky. It's a border state, right? And it's like right on the Ohio River. And so that was a river that a lot of enslaved people had to cross when they were trying to escape into freedom. And so there's a whole history in Cincinnati, like a really rich history with the Underground Railroad and a kind of a whole community of like a free black community that existed in the 19th century that of course was, subject to the same kind of Jim Crow laws and segregation that pervaded a lot. And so they were able to kind of like walk people through that history. And then in the second week, they do like a whole exercise on empathy and kind of take people through sort of some of the interpersonal work and are kind of walking people through that. And the section that I was going to read was a section that was focused on, I think it was week 4 or so, which is the first time that, Jess and her group, I think, start to really connect, where they kind of get beyond that moment where, Jess tells these like stories about her past and everyone just kind of sits there silently, isn't really sure what to say, and they kind of move on, and they're starting to kind of move to a different stage, and so I'll just describe a little bit of that. Let me just think about where to start. Okay. Some small groups in Undivided never achieved the kind of community of belonging that was necessary to make this work happen. Jess's group took 4 weeks. Until then, it was Jess's commitment to and trust in Crossroads that made her keep coming back to Undivided. When Jess was first released from prison, she was too busy for church. As part of her parole, she had to participate in outpatient drug treatment several days a week and check in regularly with her probation officer. To regain custody of her 6-year-old son, she enrolled in parenting education classes through the Ohio Child Protective Services and navigated what turned out to be a year-long court process. It was all-consuming. Jess almost lost custody because her felony conviction made it challenging to find a home where she could live with her son. To salvage the opportunity, Jess's mom moved out of her trailer so Jess could move in, enabling her to regain custody 2 weeks before her son's 7th birthday. Jess never took her family's generosity for granted. Initially, she had been unsure whether they would welcome her back, given the fact that she had stolen from them and forged checks in their names. But her mom and her sister warmly welcomed Jess into their lives, even as Jess's sister was pregnant with her first child. So when her sister began battling a severe bout of postpartum depression, Jess was desperate to do something. She was afraid her sister was going to kill herself, and she didn't know how to help her. Jess can't remember who suggested trying Crossroads, but Jess had been wanting to find a church since Sergeant Harris had helped her develop a relationship with God. She convinced her sister to accompany her. They felt a little sheepish the first time they attended services in late 2015. Jess and her sister had never been to a megachurch like Crossroads. The brightly lit lobby, the crowds of people milling around, the free artisan coffee bar, and the overtly friendly greeters overwhelmed them. They found 2 seats in the back of the auditorium. Both were relieved when the house lights went down, spotlighting the band on stage. Like many other megachurches in America, Crossroads dispensed with traditional liturgical services. There was no reason, Crossroads thought, that prim steeples, august altars, and uncomfortable wooden pews had to define people's church experience. Nothing against the wooden pews, of course. The services themselves lacked the stylistic trappings of traditional Protestant churches. During worship, there were no altars on stage at Crossroads, and the clergy did not wear traditional religious vestments. The services were multimedia, multisensory affairs with full bands and accompanying singers. An older white congregant in Crossroads who grew up in a traditional Presbyterian church once told me that he hated Crossroads the first time it went. It was so loud and so irreverent, but then he got hooked. Irreverence was actually a source of pride for Crossroads. They wanted to be funny, hip, and modern to engage people that most churches could not reach. It worked for Jess and her sister. The first time they attended Easter services at Crossroads, the production team shot confetti from the stage, released balloons from the ceiling, and rolled out a giant cake with communion wafers nestled into the icing. Jesus is alive, they declared. It's a party. Sitting in the back of the dark auditorium in Oakley, that's the name of the campus where they were, listening to the messages about the promise of salvation through Jesus, and witnessing the impact of Crossroads in the community, Jess's sister discovered her relationship with God and soon began attending therapy. After the Easter party in 2016, she decided to get baptized. Baptisms in non-denominational evangelical communities were literally often immersive affairs. The baptismal candidate was fully dunked in any available body of water. For Jess's sister, it was a water tank Crossroads set up on the main stage in Oakley after weekly services. People lined up to get baptized under the spotlight while onlookers cheered. When Jess's sister was pulled out of the water, dripping wet and committed to Jesus, Jess cried. A volunteer was waiting with a towel for her at the end of the baptismal tank, but Jess grabbed it out of her hands. "Let me do this part." She wrapped her sister in the towel, the 2 of them sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm convinced that Crossroads saved my sister's life," Jess said as she reflected on that moment. "It felt like atonement. If I did nothing else, at least I helped my sister find Jesus."
Jess's loyalty to Crossroads engendered a willingness to stick with Undivided even when she was uncomfortable. Connection cultivated commitment. She was surprised one week in Undivided to see one of her college professors participating in one of the other small groups. Jess had gone back to school after regaining custody of her son through a statewide program dedicated to trying to help the formerly incarcerated attain jobs with the state. As part of her degree, she landed in a sociology class with a Black professor. Near the end of the semester, he lectured on the Black experience in America. Jess remembered him beginning his lecture, quote, "Most people think the last racist killed Martin Luther King and then racism was over." Jess cocked her head, pausing while taking notes. What? She thought. That's not true? Implausible as it was, Jess had never questioned the narrative that America's race problem had been solved. His lecture opened Jess's eyes to things she had never known before: persistent racial disparities in income, wealth, and education, disproportionate incarceration rates of Black men, the history of the Black Panther Party, and so on. He introduced her to words that she had never heard, like blackface. During the lecture, she thought about the murders of Michael Brown in Missouri, Eric Garner in New York, and Samuel DuBose in Cincinnati, and the ensuing controversies about policing in America. Until then, Jess had never known what to make of the news, always unsure about the trustworthiness of media. But by this point in the semester, she trusted her professor. People's ability to enact change is often most potent within their own trusted social networks. Jess called her sister as soon as the lecture was over. "You're never going to believe this stuff," she said, flabbergasted by how different it was from what they had learned as children. Each week after Undivided, she did the same, joking on the phone with her sister about their ignorance. The bonds of community began to emerge in Jess's group during the fourth week. That session was dedicated to helping people excavate their racial identities and break down their assumptions about race. After taking an implicit association test, people stood in a circle and the facilitator read out a list of statements. Those for whom the statement was true walked into the middle of the circle. For Jess, the exercise started simply enough. Quote, "I grew up with 2 parents at home. I have a college degree. I have been incarcerated." Jess froze. By then, she had been pretty open with her group about her father and his past, but she had never considered admitting to others in Undivided that she was a convicted felon. She felt unprepared for the moment. The facilitator paused. Jess's mind raced. "I'm in church. I can't admit this." She considered staying where she was. No one else was walking to the middle of the circle. Jess looked down at her hands. She had just gotten a new tattoo, a small lotus flower, on the inside of her left wrist. She described it to her friends as a symbol of the journey of the spiritual self through life, love, death, and recovery. The petals of the flower were colored in different shades of blue, and the stem was slightly twisted. Jess walked into the middle of the circle and stood there, alone. She locked eyes with Patricia, the older Black woman who was one of the co-facilitators in her group. Patricia blinked, and her eyebrows lifted slightly. Cutting the tension of people's gaze with her laughter, Jess said, I guess no one looks at this white girl and thinks, she's a felon." Everyone laughed. Jess walked back to the edge of the circle. Later, the facilitator read another statement, quote, "I have been addicted to drugs." Jess walked into the middle of the circle and stood alone, again. This time, her group didn't seem surprised. Jess looked directly at the Black man in the group whose eyes she had been avoiding all these weeks. He nodded. Jess smiled with relief and flicked her eyes to Patricia. "My child is in long-term recovery right now," Patricia said. "I'm in long-term recovery too," Jess replied. The exercise continued, asking people about their experiences with money, race, and poverty. "I've gone to bed hungry. I haven't had enough money to pay my rent or my mortgage. I have been discriminated against because of my race." Jess was surprised to learn that white rather than Black participants in her group were more likely to have experienced poverty. She thought about all the things her dad and other relatives had told her about Black Americans being poor and lazy. The relief of acceptance had loosened Jess's guard. She blurted out, I always thought Black people were poor." As soon as the words were out of her mouth, Jess regretted them. "Oh my God," she thought, "I just said it out loud." But others in her group laughed instead of getting angry. They were willing to give her latitude. As that night's session was ended, one of the women asked if anyone wanted to continue the conversation over dinner. All 8 people did. They found a Steak and Shake about a quarter mile from the Oakley campus that was open on a Monday night and decided to meet there. The restaurant looked like a classic 1950s diner with black and white tiles on the floor and red pleather seats arranged around Formica tables. There were not many other customers there, and it was easy for them to rearrange the tables to seat everyone in the group together. This impromptu dinner turned out to be a pivotal turning point for Jess and her group. There were 2 Black women, 1 Black man, 1 Asian woman, Jess, and 3 other white people. The Asian woman, an immigrant from China, described the legal challenges she had to go through to maintain her visa. Jess spoke about her experience in prison and finding Jesus. Patricia, the black woman whose child was fighting addiction, traded stories about recovery and relapse with Jess. The black man teased Jess gently about the stereotypes she had confessed to the group that night. His gentle jokes made Jess's shoulders relax. She laughed with him about her ignorance. Generally cautious about the things that she shared with others, Jess described herself as a private person, somewhat wary in social situations. But when she was feeling comfortable, she laughed deeply and heartily. "Those are just the things my dad told me," she said. "It's not just your dad," he said. "Everyone says those things." The group discussed the way local news stations offered imbalanced portrayals of black and white communities in the city. The white facilitator, whom Jess had not liked the first week, talked about how she had to work to dismantle media stereotypes of black people that she'd internalized in her own mind. Jess felt like she was beginning to understand where the woman was coming from. The waitstaff had to ask the group to leave at 10:30 because the restaurant was closing. They all got up to go, but they couldn't stop talking amongst themselves. While the workers wiped down the chairs and swept stray fries and spilled sugar packets up from the floor, the group kept talking. It was a Monday night, and most people probably had to go to work the next day, but no one could bring themselves to leave. Jess finally got into her 2007 blue Scion to drive home to Batavia, a town outside Cincinnati. She thought about her dad, her struggle with heroin and other opioids, and then her time in prison. She thought about the hours of conversation in the vault with Sergeant Harris and felt for the first time that maybe he would be proud. Pause there. So maybe I'll just say one more thing before we kind of open up for discussion, which is one of the things that I realized in doing this research is that so I had never encountered a megachurch like Crossroads. I grew up in Houston, Texas, and so there actually are a lot of megachurches in Houston. There's actually one like right by my parents' house, but I'd never gone to one, and so I didn't really know what they were like. But I've now come to understand that there's a lot of megachurches like Crossroads, like all over the country. A megachurch is, and just to kind of give you a few stats on this, a megachurch is defined as a church that's 2,000 or more people. The average megachurch in America has about, I don't have exactly the numbers right, so don't quote me on them, but I have the magnitude right. They have about 5,000 people. They have a budget of about $6 million a year, and 96% of their budget comes from individual donations. The largest megachurch in America is probably about 80,000 people, and the average megachurch has grown by about 34% in the past decade. So church attendance in America has gotten so skewed towards megachurches that the largest 9% of churches in America contain 50% of the church-going population, right? And so I think there's a whole conversation we could have about the value of megachurches, and how you might think about them from a theological perspective and a spiritual perspective, and also from a community perspective. But as a political scientist, like one of the things I was interested in is that they just have a lot of people who are part of their communities. Like they're drawing a lot of people towards them, and so it was really interesting to kind of think about how Crossroads and how Undivided was located within this larger landscape of this kind of work in America. So really interested to kind of hear your thoughts and reactions and open up the conversation. So.
And I have a microphone so that the people who are watching this on the live stream can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have the image of you, a Korean, at the interface between black people and white people.
Uh-huh.
And you're talking to us about them. How did they see you?
Yep.
Did the white people see you as being one of them? And I'm pretty sure that the black people saw you as an honorary white.
Right.
How did it work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's actually something that I thought a lot about when I was entering into this project. And not just for reasons of my race, but for lots of reasons, right? And so just to give you, so I grew up in Texas. I was raised going to Catholic schools, and so, was kind of raised in the Catholic Church. But then my parents were immigrants from Korea, and so even though we went to Catholic schools, like I was sort of raised with kind of like a Buddhist tradition, so I probably had more of a kind of Buddhist orientation theologically. Definitely not, evangelical, not Protestant. It wasn't a community that I was familiar with. And so I felt like I was kind of an outsider, both in terms of my faith tradition, also the fact that I was a college professor. I was from like an East Coast, like fancy university, and so, all these things that kind of stereotypically would be the kind of things that would pit me against, Midwestern evangelicals and things like that. And and then to your point, also the fact that, I'm Korean, and, often like being Asian American is sort of this kind of like liminal category of race in America, and it's sort of, I think, thought about really differently, especially in communities that have like really strong sort of black-white relationships. And so I think I entered into some of that, that conversation hesitantly, but what I found was that, so one of the things I really learned a lot from this work is that Crossroads has a motto that they really do enact, and their motto is belonging comes before belief, right? And they explicitly kind of like talk about that in the church. It's like, it's written down in like different kind of ideas. And the idea is that, we're a church, we believe that Jesus is the Savior, we believe in a Christian God, but you don't have to believe in any of those things to be a part of our community. You can be atheist, you can be, you can adhere to whatever faith tradition you want, but no matter what, like, you belong to us. And they had this whole ethos of this like radical hospitality that they welcome people into, but they're not shy about the fact that they're trying to evangelize you, so they want to take you on this journey. So I found that in most of my interactions, that people always wanted to know about me before they'd be willing to open up about themselves, but I was always just very frank about, where I was and what my own kind of spiritual orientation was, and why I was so interested in learning about their experiences. And then people, I think, really were quite welcoming. The other thing I will add, one of the things that was, I think, sometimes where there was maybe a little bit of friction was less around the things that I maybe was concerned about in the beginning, but things, I have 2 children. My youngest child identifies as gender fluid, and so very often, especially I think if you're a woman, people are like, oh, like, do you have children? And they ask you about it, and you say, oh yeah, I have 2 children. And then the first question they always ask is, oh, boys or girls? And then, I always said like, oh, it's kind of a complicated answer, and I'd sort of explain, the situation, and very often, because in these Protestant evangelical communities, like, a lot of people are really uncomfortable with the idea of having a child who identifies as gender fluid, and they would get visibly uncomfortable, and part of what I learned, I think, as I got to know the community is that, but there's an ethos of like stepping into that tension as opposed to avoiding it, and so, like, as a mom, I felt like I couldn't deny the truth of my child when I was describing my child to other people, and it would create like actual visibly uncomfortable moments, and we would talk about it, and with different kinds of people, we'd have different kinds of conversations. Sometimes they were very short, and sometimes they were really long, but that was part of the ethos of the community that I came to really respect. And I think that was one of the reasons that this huge, the community is very challenging in a lot of ways, and there's a big pro-Trump contingent, very big anti-Trump contingent, but unusually in America right now, they're able to kind of hold together people that have like a really wide range of views, and and contend with difference in that way. And that is one thing I think that I found interesting about the community.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I wonder about if you've kept up with the community since your time, and I missed the beginning, so I'm not sure if your research, how long you were there starting in 2016, yep. What it looks like now as divisiveness has continued and polarization has increased, and also if you've heard from any other similar communities, other megachurches who have also implemented a plan like this. Is this replicable? We have in the Episcopal Church something called Sacred Ground, which is an anti-racism training program. Many folks at Redeemer have participated in that. And it, different churches all across our denomination have done it, and I think it takes hold some places more than others. So I'm really curious about replicability.
Yeah. Yes, so I definitely have stayed still in very close touch with all of them. So I started doing, I first discovered them in 2016 when I was doing, I think maybe you weren't here for this, but I was doing research on like a ballot initiative that was going on in 2016. And then, the research that's covered in the book probably went through 2023, so it's about 7 years of research. And and it wasn't like I lived in Baltimore for most of that time, so it wasn't like I ever like went there, but I went to Cincinnati a lot, but also during COVID, like, they switched everything to online, so then I could participate in a lot of the sessions online, and and then once I got to know some of the core characters in the book, I mean, I would consider us friends. I think they would say that too, like we're friends, and our families have met each other, and we've hung out, and they've come. Some of them have when they've come to DC, like we've gone down, we've gotten together, and so like it's when you spend this much time with someone and you're talking about things I think that are so deeply personal, it's hard not to build that kind of a relationship. So very much still happening. So a couple things though in terms of like what's happened. So one of the things that I didn't kind of read about, and this is like really helpful because this is the kind of thing that I need to learn before I start doing more of these book talks is, the sections that I read to you were really about the kind of 6-week program where where they kind of take people through this initial curriculum, and the real goal of that program is to like animate people to kind of be motivated to do this work, but like you're not going to get rid of racism in 6 weeks. Like it's like an implausible thing, right? And so the real work I think began as the program ended, and what they did was they invited people into a series of what they called on-ramps. And the on-ramps were like different ways for them to kind of carry this mission out in different communities. And so they gave people a range of different options. So one of them was like, getting involved in a program that did ministry in the prisons. Another one was getting involved in Issue 44, which is a ballot initiative around universal preschool. And so people had like different kind of options that they could do. And they sort of kind of stumbled through this, so it wasn't like designed over time, but they kind of realized like as people got involved in these programs, they were like, oh wait, like now we need some kind of like structure to help like organize that work. And so they built what was called a justice team. And and so they kind of like sort of stumbled through. And so part of what I say at the end of the book is that I don't at all, and I say this at the beginning of the book too, I don't at all mean to like lift up Undivided as this like magic bullet that like if only everyone did this 6-week program, it's gonna like eradicate racism from people's hearts. Like I don't think they wouldn't claim that, and I think that's certainly not what I found. It's more that they were able to create a culture of belonging and a commitment to sort of staying in the work, and then create a vehicle that enabled that to sort of continue. And every single character faced backlash at some point, right? There's one character who's a black woman who was married to a white man, and he is really resistant as she gets involved in this. And so their marriage experiences a lot of tension during the sort of 4 years between 2016 and 2020 as she's getting deeper into Undivided and he's going in exactly the opposite direction. And so it's like, how does she decide how she's going to sort of carry that tension between her husband, the father of her children, and the commitments towards justice that she's developing and what she feels like are her faith commitments? And these are really hard questions to answer. And so it's really like that's where I think the rubber hits the road. This is like a really long answer to your question. So, anyways, so in terms of replicability, I think it's not just a 6-week program that has to get replicated. It's kind of this question of how do you create this like infrastructure that carries the work forward beyond that 6 weeks. So 6 weeks is like the spark, but the hard work kind of comes afterwards. But then to answer your question more concretely, so one of the things that Crossroads does very commonly is they will often like incubate programs and then spin them off into their own kind of entities. And so Undivided was incubated at Crossroads, and then it spun off and became its own 501c3. So it's now its own 501c3, is continuing to do work in the Crossroads and Cincinnati community, but it also works in like other megachurches and other communities across the U.S. And so they actually also did a version of the program with a police force in a small town in Ohio that wanted to participate. So it was like the police force and the city leaders came together with some of kind of leaders from communities of color in the community, and they did Undivided together. They've taken it, I think, there's a church outside of Chicago, a mega church outside Chicago and a mega church in Michigan who have been two of the churches that have kind of carried it forward the most. And they've sort of taken the curriculum, adopted that 6 weeks, and then figured out their own vehicles for carrying it forward. So, but there's many of these kinds of programs that are out there, and I don't know that Undivided is particularly unique, except it's just like it's the one that I got to know. So, in that sense, yeah. So Claire and I are in the same book club, and so she used to see me next week for dinner, so
That's true. But I heard you call this group Protestant evangelicals.
Uh-huh.
And I have people in my family who are evangelicals, and they use the word Christian.
Yes.
And my impression of her and her friends and the rest of her group and people I know all over the place is that evangelicals have usurped the word Christian.
Yes.
Protestant is not something that they use. I don't know if they used it. That's what my question to you is, did they use it? And the other thing, I don't know if you've seen any of this, but they are evangelical Christians, and I'm a non-believer.
Uh-huh.
And anybody who doesn't believe in evangelical Christianity is a non-believer. And it just seems like they're being divisive.
That they're being divisive.
Yeah, because they don't respect other beliefs.
Right.
But that's just my impression of everything that I've learned.
Yep. So there's I have a lot to sort of things that a lot that I think I've learned as real. So just to clarify that was the kind of first question. I sort of describe it in the book in the sections that I read as non-denominational Protestant evangelicalism, just to kind of, because there are, and in most of the book I try to sort of clarify that it's white Protestant evangelicalism, because obviously there's like the black church that has like a wholly different trajectory than the white church that I'm describing, and that's more to kind of differentiate it from other kind of evangelical traditions that exist in other. But yeah, I think you're right that if I were to talk to the average Crossroads person, they would say that I'm Christian, or I'm a Christ follower, or something like that. On the point about sort of how people kind of use the terminology, so one of the things that I have found that's really interesting, I think, and this is like probably a phenomenon over the past like 5 to 7 years, and really a kind of function of the Trump era too, is the term evangelical has also become really loaded. And so what we know from looking at the survey data is that the percentage of people who self-identify on surveys as evangelical that also go to church weekly on Sundays went down by like 30 to 40% during the Trump era, right? And so, and there's lots of other patterns like that you could describe. I saw one survey, I don't believe these numbers, but I did see the survey, where 40% of people who self-identify as evangelical said they don't believe that Jesus is the Savior, which is kind of definitional, by the way. So it's really hard to put those things together, right? And so what that means is that evangelical has become, for many people, more of a political identity than a faith identity, right? And so the people that are identifying as, when a pollster calls them and says, are you evangelical, are you born again, the people that are saying yes are people that comport with the kind of political agenda or the political identity of the church, even if whether or not they go to church, whether or not they actually are part of a faith community. And so putting my social scientist hat on, I think that there's the data that we have when you sort of see the stats, the exit polls that say 8 in 10, evangelicals voted for Trump, those are 8 in 10 people who self-identify as evangelical. Those may or may not be the people who are showing up to the pews. It may or may not be the people who adhere to the actual faith tenets of the church, And so that being said, there's definitely a lot of people who adhere to the faith tenets and also the political agenda of the church, so I'm not minimizing that. But I think there's more heterogeneity than we understand. And to your point, the words that we have are often we're not using them in nuanced enough ways to kind of capture the sort of heterogeneity that does exist. There's a scholar whose work I cite in the book is a guy named Wes Markowski, who teaches at Carleton College, and he's a sociologist, and he has a term that he calls the other evangelicals, which are, as he defines it, people who are evangelical by faith but don't subscribe to the political agenda of the church. And he estimates that it's 30 to 40% of the kind of the people who identify as evangelicals by faith. So it's a pretty large proportion of the community. The other thing that I learned is that, as I was doing research into this and the history of a lot of this is, within evangelicalism, there's lots of different traditions of different kind of evangelical churches that have emerged. And the churches that we hear about in the news tend to be like prosperity gospel churches that are, tend to have like a lot of support for Trump or white Christian nationalism and things like that. That's definitely prevalent, like in a lot of different strands of evangelicalism. Crossroads comes out of a tradition that is probably called the seeker-sensitive tradition, which is focused much less on pursuing a political agenda and much more on kind of missionary work, right? Like the goal is growth. And so that has its own set of critiques, right? Because like part of the reason why they shoot confetti from the stage and bring out a cake on Easter is because they're trying to make it fun. They want church to be hip and cool because they want to draw more people in. And people who critique it would critique whether or not that's actually, is entertaining people actually kind of doing the sort of spiritual formation that we want to be doing. And so there's a critique of that too. But a lot of the kind of biggest churches that we see in America come out of that growth tradition, and they tend to be less political. So there's like all this kind of like heterogeneity, I think, that's worth kind of thinking about. But then to your last point about, doesn't it seem divisive because of the kind of belief that like you're either a believer or you're a non-believer? So yeah, I think, that's where it's like, when I entered into these conversations about my child, for example, with some people, and I could tell they were like, what are you doing? Like, you're raising, this is like a horrible thing that you're doing to your child by kind of enabling, and I think they were like genuinely concerned about my child, and I felt kind of genuinely offended that they were sort of saying those things, and I think that's where it's like you really have to think about, like what, like as a human, I'm trying to relate to this other human. We have these kind of like diametrically opposed beliefs, right? And how are we going to enter into this conversation to be able to try to kind of like see and understand each other? And what I do respect about Crossroads, even though I do think there are people that probably have the kind of beliefs that you're describing, is that because of that kind of commitment to belonging, people were always willing to kind of enter into that tension with me, And so I think that's one thing that, I certainly, in my other day job, I do a lot of work with like different kind of political organizations, and a lot of them, it's like as soon as things get tense or conflictual, they like walk away from it, because people don't like conflict, like it's hard. And so I respect the sort of ability to kind of enter into the tension, even if it can come from a place that can be challenging, I think, sometimes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. You kind of already touched on the answer to my question, I think, but I just wanted you to talk a little about is the program Undivided inextricably linked to the megachurch? Because it seems like
linked to the megachurch, is that what you said?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
So it just seems to me that the program could be an incredibly powerful community organizing tool,
Yep.
a political tool away from the religious overtones.
Yeah.
And just if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So just kind of give a little bit of background on how it, so, Undivided kind of was birthed when when Chuck, this black preacher, kind of spoke about his calling to speak about race, and he gets this outpouring of support, and he's like, oh my God, like, what am I gonna do, right? And so he assembles essentially a planning team, and this, I think, was, very, I don't know that he did it intentionally, but it was kind of very wise on his part. He assembled a planning team that brought together people with a lot of different experiences across Cincinnati. So there was a woman who is, and part of this is because Crossroads is so big and has so much reach into other institutions throughout the city that he could just, these are people who are part of the community that he could draw in. So there was a woman, a black woman who was the head, led a lot of the diversity work at the Children's Hospital in Cincinnati, which is like a big institution in the city. There was another black woman who had been an executive. There was a white woman who had been an executive with U.S. Bank. Like, she was named like one of the like 25 most powerful women in banking or something like that by like U.S. Banking magazine. There was a man who led. A white man who led one of the biggest community organizing groups in the city, So he kind of brought together people from the corporate sector, from the faith community, from the community organizing sector, and they all kind of came in with I think a lot of skepticism and also realism about the sort of ability of these kind of programs to do the work, which is how they sort of came to come up with the curriculum that they decided. So I think, anyways, this is a long way of saying that, I don't that it's tied to the mega church. I do think that there were certain things about the culture of Crossroads that made it more likely to kind of stick with people in a certain way, and I don't know if it would transfer to other kind of cultures in the same, organizational cultures in the same way. But, you know, they've created a version that they did with the police force that was a-religious. Like it didn't, you know, they took out all the sort of references. I mean, the version they do with the church is very theologically grounded, and they took all that out, you know, for the version. They have a workplace version that they've done with, I think they did it with Kroger maybe, or like other kind of big corporations. And so, yeah, I do think that there is a lot that can be used from other places. But, you know, again, like I feel like one of the things that I really learned was that it wasn't a magic bullet. It was a combination of that plus this like infrastructure of support that they were able to kind of sustain over time. That really made these journeys, I think, so powerful.
Hahrie, I'm afraid we're out of time. I'm sure there are more questions, but I think what we should maybe do is thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And I think I can confidently say that we'll buy your book and maybe offer, you can say something about, we were the first ones that you sort of offered it to.
Yeah.
And if people that have questions, could they come up and talk
please.
to you
I'm totally
afterwards?
happy to have other questions. And yeah, the book it's going to be available in September, so I would appreciate it if you're interested to reach out. And thank you so much for inviting me. And like I said, it's my first thing, kind of unveiling of the book, and so I appreciate having such a friendly audience to do that with.
So great. Thanks, Hahrie.